I'm sure all of us know about airplanes that have one engine, two engines, maybe even four or more engines. But what if we told you there is a category of aircraft that can fly without any engine? I mean, no engine, zero, zip, nil. In this episode of Aviation Intrigue, we're going to introduce you to these amazing flying machines and tell you some of the incredible things they can accomplish. You're going to be surprised, maybe even shocked to find out how high, how far, and how long they can fly. So stick with us. We are ready for departure.
This is aviation intrigue.
Okay, tell me, people, we just talked about aircraft with no engines. In your opinion, how high can this go? What do you think is the altitude record right now? Go to the comment section and let us know. Later in this episode, we will reveal what the current altitude records are, and you are going to be, wow, I did not know that, because there are some incredible numbers. But like they say on TV infomercials, wait, there's more. We have more interesting facts to reveal. So keep watching and keep listening.
That leaves us with a basic question here. Without an engine, how do gliders get off the ground?
That is a very good question. So forget about flying. First thing is how you have to get off the ground. And there are many ways gliders can get off the ground.
It's kind of like a kite, maybe getting into the air on a windy day, something like that, maybe.
Exactly. Like if you have ever flown a kite in a park, you have a kite, which obviously doesn't have an engine, and you tie a string to it and you pull the string against the wind until the kite takes off. If it is a nice windy day, the kite flies. If it is not, the kite doesn't fly. In a glider, it's a little bit similar. We have something called a winch, which is a long metal cable, like a steel cable with a motor, and literally the glider is attached to it and the motor spins, pulling the glider until the glider becomes airborne and it can release from the cable. It sounds a little scary, and maybe it is, but it's also an exhilarating feeling because you are accelerating so quickly.
I've heard it described like a roller coaster ride. Is it anything like that when you do a winch launch?
Yeah, so to some extent, it is pulling and you're sitting there. You're not really controlling anything. You're going for the ride. So the roller coaster analogy is probably a very apt thing.
It sounds like a lot of fun. And there's another launch method that's pretty common to gliders. That's tow planes, using airplanes to get off the ground. Can you talk about what that's like?
Yeah, actually, that is probably the most common way to launch these gliders. Think of a small single engine airplane, typically used for crop dusting for agriculture purposes. And we attach a 200 feet nylon rope to the back of that airplane, which has an engine, obviously. And the other end is a glider, and we attach it to the nose of the glider or the belly of the glider. And as the propeller plane accelerates, the glider gets pulled together and we go up to 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 4,000 feet, whatever you want. And then you can release from the tow plane and then you can fly by yourself.
So you're not flying with the tow rope, though. That leaves with the tow plane and they go ahead and land. Meanwhile, the glider is free to soar.
Yeah. So whether you're using the winch method or the tow plane method, when you reach a altitude that you're comfortable with, you detach from it, you release the rope. So the rope or the cable goes away, and now you are soaring by yourself. It is an incredible feeling once you detach from it. It's very quiet. Everything goes silent. It is beautiful feeling.
And I've seen those cases where they can launch the glider using the slope of a hill.
Well, we call them gliders, but actually the technical name may be sailplanes. There are hang gliders and paragliders and maybe even parasailing if those of you have done that on ocean front. But if you happen to be in a certain geography where there are hills, it is possible to launch these gliders by rolling down a hill, and then as it rolls down it picks up speed and then picks up lift and then it can fly. Again, it is a little scary to describe it. It becomes very natural, and it's actually a really good feeling to be doing that.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I've never tried parasailing or paragliding, so that's something I'm going to maybe look at trying. It sounds like a place like New Zealand where there's beautiful hills and slopes is a place to try it.
Yeah, speaking of New Zealand, we were in New Zealand several years ago, and we did tandem paragliding where we are attached to a instructor and we run down a slope, and then you start soaring. At that point, you kind of run out of slope. It's a sheer cliff. And then you start flying. It is amazing because you feel like a bird. It's the closest you ever feel to being a bird, I guess. It's very, very interesting feeling. There are certain countries, for example, some Eastern European countries by the mountainside, where they do launch much more commonly by a sailplane or a glider using a hillside.
So let me get this straight. You, Go Pal, you were running with your legs towards a sheer drop off cliff in New Zealand with a paraglider instructor, and you went flying that way.
Exactly. Isn't that crazy? It sounds crazy when I describe it, but that's exactly it. Thank goodness we had an instructor. To make things interesting, the instructor had a selfie stick with a digital camera attached, and then at the end, you got a CD with you doing it.
That
So
is
not only
so
we were
awesome.
flying, it was amazing experience. If anybody has not tried it, highly recommend doing that.
It does sound a little scary, even though I have some sailplane experience, but I'm definitely going to look into that. And I bet the videos and pictures are just absolutely amazing. So we'll definitely look into that. Awesome.
Yeah, outside of this paragliding experience, all my glider flying has been with a tow plane, with a with an airplane pulling us in the rope. And typically, we get to 2,000, 3,000 feet and detach. And it's pretty spectacular. But I have heard that the winch launch is very exhilarating, and of course, hillside launch will be probably even more, especially considering the scenery.
So there's a lot of different ways to get off the ground depending on where you are.
Yeah, exactly. And depending on where you are and what facilities you have, you would use different methods. There are also ways to launch it behind a car. There are people who have launched it by literally pulling a glider behind a car. Again, that's like you running with a kite in a string until the kite flies. It's not that different, but again, it sounds kind of crazy, but they all work.
It's okay, but this is one of those things where we should maybe say here, like, don't try this at home. There's some training involved and some rules involved. And so we can all picture a car towing a glider at this point. I can definitely get the kite metaphor, but that's something that does require a little bit of know-how, I would think.
Yeah, needless to say, if you want to try that, go find a glider club, get an instructor, and do it the right way. Don't just hook up to your pickup truck and go trying it. That's not recommended.
Okay, so we're off the ground in the sailplane or the glider, and what happens from there? There's this thing called thermaling, I believe, that's very common in the flatter areas like the Midwest. That's really the fuel for these gliders to continue flying.
Yeah, so no matter how you got off the ground, whether you use a winch or a tow plane or a hill or a crazy pickup truck, you still need to find what we call as lift. It's really a rising air mass to stay afloat. So we get into these thermals, and sometimes we can stay there for a reasonably long amount of time. And this is literally like a rising column of air that supports the glider that allows you to fly. If you have ever seen like a eagle or a hawk, they effortlessly keep circling. Have you ever seen that? And
Definitely.
they go in the spiral and they keep gaining altitude, but they do it so effortlessly. It comes so natural. In a glider, we're trying to do the same thing. In fact, you would see these gliders go in circles because these thermals that we talk about are relatively small. I tend to think of them like a smokestack, like a smoke coming out of a chimney. They are like a cylinder that rises. And so you want to stay inside it. If you do, you can go fairly high all the way to where the clouds are. Sometimes it is fun. If you know how to find it, you can stay in the air for a very long time.
But since we can't see the thermals, it takes some know-how or it takes some weather analysis to actually know if it's a good day to get up high. Is that what you plan for during a glider session?
Yeah, exactly. I wish I can see those thermals. So we say in glider flying that half the battle is finding where the thermals are, and half the battle is actually controlling your airplane to stay in it. Both are equally difficult. It is not easy to find it. Sometimes, if it's a good cloudy, like a fluffy white cumulus day, those are good for us because the clouds will most likely indicate where the thermals are. So we can go look for those clouds. But then again, everything like wind, the sun, what kind of terrain you're over, all those things affect. So I don't want to get too technical into it, but there's a lot of things involved. So yeah, you can't see those thermals. They are transparent. They're just air. So that's a big trick.
That makes sense. And then you mentioned terrain. So when you are near higher terrain or in mountainous areas, I know that you've got some experience in the eastern part of the country and other places where you can actually get up a little higher above the mountains and use the air currents based off of that terrain to get a little bit more distance and altitude. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we call them ridge soaring, ridge as in the a ridge of hill. So again, this could get a little complicated, but let's imagine that there is a line of hills, and let's now imagine that the wind is coming somewhat perpendicular to that ridge. So what happens when the wind hits the hill? The wind is going to get deflected up. So that is going to create this lifting action. It's not a thermal lifting action, but it is a lifting action that's caused by these winds hitting the hills and going up. And if you catch it correctly, you can essentially travel on one side of the ridge all the way, come back, and keep going back and forth. Sometimes you gain altitude, but most of the time you can just, it's like a magic carpet. You just keep riding back and forth in there. And people who do ridge soaring can stay for hours sometimes just going back and forth. And of course, you have to be careful because if the wind is too much or too little, it's possible for this to go away right away. But it's another great way of soaring that most people don't get to experience.
So that's how you manage long flights without an engine, then, unlike airplanes that have a limit with fuel and the ability to go that long and that high. Actually, with it sounds like the mountains are definitely a way to go longer and higher then. And there's contests where people compete on a given day how far and how high they can go.
Yeah, of course, if you are by a mountain or a hillside, it's better because it naturally is conducive to being able to stay there for longer. But in many parts of the country, even in flat upper Midwest here in Wisconsin, you have thermals. Springtime, late spring, early summer is fantastic because we have a lot of thermal. So think about it this way: the ground has been cold over the winter for a very long time, and then summer starts, or it feels like summer is starting, and the terrain starts to heat up. All that rising air is starting to go up. And so springtime is a great time for us to find these thermals. But if you live in a hillside, you need that ridge and you need the wind kind of going perpendicular. If not, there's a third mechanism we haven't talked about. It's called mountain waves. And this is a fascinating phenomena. This happens typically in higher mountain terrain out west in the Rockies, and you can even find it in places like the Alps, where you have these waves, not that different from waves in an ocean, except it's in the air, it's in the atmosphere, and they kind of go up and down. If you catch it properly, you can not only stay for a long time, you can also gain altitude a lot. We call them mountain wave flying.
It sounds a little bit like surfing. So you surf on a wave in the ocean, you're kind of surfing in a sailplane on a mountain wave. That's a great comparison.
Well, exactly like surfing, except for a key difference. You can't see the mountain wave. So if I take like a typical windsurfer in California or wherever, they see these waves and they know how to position themselves. So they know how to ride the wave, where to turn. When you're doing this in a mountain wave, you can't see it because it's just air. Sometimes there are cloud markers. Most of the time there isn't. So it's a little bit of a guesswork, but this is where years of training comes in. This is where experience comes in. This is where good instruction comes in. So if you go with people who are trained to do this, they will teach you what kind of little markers to look for and how to get in, because it is possible to get into these and get yourself into serious trouble. So you have to be careful with that. There is a famous project called the Perlan project. Are you familiar with that, Lane?
I've seen some things online. It looks like a really cool project.
Yeah, so Perlan project is is got some Airbus connections. It is a glider. It is like a sailplane, just like a regular glider that we fly, except it's specially constructed. The vessel or the ship itself is constructed of much more higher duty materials. And inside, the pilot can even wear uh, pressure suits. It's similar to what like a Air Force pilot would wear in combat when they're flying very high with oxygen masks and things like that. They can do that. And these Perlan flights. This is called the Perlan project. You can look it up. We will link the link in the description. Take a look at it, and they've had some historically high flights.
These are record-setting flights, I believe, and not only that, the altitudes they reach in terms of the view of the Earth, I believe, are just amazing. And you mentioned that Airbus, so the maker of the jumbo jets, the jumbo airliners, they're involved in this project.
Yeah, same Airbus, and it's some sort of a group that makes this. And obviously, not everybody can go fly this. You have to be trained. But most people will remember the name Steve Fawcett. He was a very well-known aviator. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago doing these kind of interesting missions. He was one of the first ones to fly in the Perlan project, and he set a altitude record. Are you ready for this? Over 49,000 feet.
49 record.
And that was a record that Steve Fawcett had set. I want to say let me look this up. Steve Fawcett did this in 2006. He climbed up to almost 50,000 feet. And that was in the Perlan 1. And then they made a Perlan 2 project with improvements. And those guys continue to set the record. In fact, did you know that in 1 week, they set 3 world records? Every time they flew, it was higher than the previous day. So they kept setting these world records one by one.
Oh, that is
Let me,
amazing.
yeah, indeed. So in 2017, an American, Jim Payne, and an Australian, Morgan Sandercock, they flew in this Airbus Perlan 2 project, and they reached 52,000 feet. That's over 15,000 meters. And then they set these 3 world records. You want to know what the current altitude record is?
Much higher than 50,000 feet, I'm guessing. What's the record?
Yeah, the current record, according to the world records, is 76,124 feet, which, by the way, is even higher than the U2 spy plane, which goes very high, 76,124 feet. And that organization is not quite done yet. They are trying to get to 90,000 feet.
That's their goal, 90,000 feet. Even exceeding 70,000, that's well above what a military aircraft has done. So they've gotten
Yeah,
above
exactly.
and beyond. Wow.
And then when you fly there, that's why they wear this pressure suit. So we cannot just go there. Our body cannot take this. It's the same as being in a submarine. So they wear these pressure suits. You want to make sure that the pressure changes don't make the airplane implode or explode. And so there's a lot of precautions. So you can't just simply take any glider and fly it that high. So that's why I'm sure they spend tons of money and there's a lot of training. Physically, they need to be fit. It's just for any of you, we'll put all these links in the description. Take a look at it and you can even watch these videos. And it's a really cool project.
Really cool videos off of that. And we're talking, even with the old records, that's like the edge of space. So they have to have the pressure suits and the oxygen and all that equipment. So we're talking some extreme altitudes here. And that's something to look into. That's really great stuff. I cannot believe that a glider is what holds the altitude record. And now that you explained it, it makes a little bit more sense. Thanks.
But even if you put away the Perlan project, in a regular glider, people have climbed almost up to 50,000 feet. Most people don't do that. So you need very specific atmospheric conditions like this mountain wave we talked about. That's how they climb, by the way. They get into this mountain wave and they keep going and going and going. So you need to have the proper conditions. I have personally gone up to 10 or 11,000 feet in a
Wow.
glider, but I know several people that I've flown with or I've known that have routinely gone over 18,000 feet. And of course, 18,000 feet and above, that's where the jets fly. So you have to be careful, making sure that you're not going to run into a real Airbus. But yeah, so the records are just mind-boggling.
And 11,000 feet, that's pretty good. And I understand you're a pretty experienced glider pilot. In fact, you helped introduce me to my glider training. And I think since I got my rating, my personal record is maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet. So I'm getting there. That's about as high as I've gone myself in a glider. And I can tell you, even at that altitude, it's really fun. Really fun way to fly.
It is, and it takes experience. And honestly, the kind of glider you fly also can dictate how high you can go or how long you can stay. Many of the trainer gliders, Elaine, that we start to train on, they can't fly that high because they're not what we call as a high performance gliders. But most of the sailplanes that people own are high performance gliders that can handle altitudes, not very high altitude. By the way, if in my glider I'm going to fly that high, I'm going to have an oxygen mask. So I need to be able to have an oxygen mask and everything else. So some special purpose is required.
It sounds like the higher you go, the more equipment you may need due to oxygen. I know that anything above 10,000 feet, you've got to seriously consider having oxygen available unless you're just up there for a couple of minutes before you come back down. Speaking of which, you talked about mountain soaring, mountain waves, thermaling, getting really high and really far. I think people are wondering, like, how do you get back, or do you just land somewhere else, or do you actually get back to where you launched from, and how does that work?
Yeah, so in most cases, we aim to land back where we started or an intended point of landing. So we can say we're going to go from this place to there. These gliders, once they land, you have to like pull them off the runway. They don't have an engine, so you can't taxi them off the runway. So you need people. So you have to plan glider flights. By the way, many people have landed in farmers' fields, in unintended airfields, because sometimes you just run out of lift. You just don't have that wind that was carrying you up there. It's no longer there. It happens. In fact, that's a we say in the glider community, it's a little bit of a rite of passage where you always land out. That's a term we use, where you're landing at a farmer's field or on a grass area somewhere. And yep, that's all part of the experience. It's really remarkable and very different than what people do on a daily basis. Okay, so you heard what we said is the record altitude. I'm sure you're surprised. So now we have another question for you. How far do you think gliders have gone, or how long do you think they have stayed up in the air? Write in your comments, and then later we're going to reveal this to you.
So we talked about altitudes and those amazing altitude records, and with distances involved, that's got to be pretty astounding too from what you talked about with gliders. How far can they go?
So before we talk about how far can they go, let's talk about how do they go from place to place. So I think most people will understand if you're in a propeller airplane or a jet airplane, you use a propeller, you use a jet, and that's how you go places. And let's face it, you can go as long as you have fuel. In this case, you don't have fuel, you don't have an engine. So you are dependent on these natural factors that we talked about, thermals and hills, the wind, mountain waves, etc. So you are very dependent on Mother Nature, no question. So let's go to the thermals that we started talking about, right? Remember, these are like air columns, like chimneys or smokestacks, like the hawks fly. We talked about circling. So I like to think of it as using it like an elevator. So if I catch one of those thermals and keep circling until I get as high as I can go, let's say I go to 5,000 feet, then what we do is that we get off that and try to find the next column of air. And remember, I can't always see it. Sometimes there's clouds which can tell us. Then we glide from one of these thermal to another thermal. By the time we get there, we probably lost some altitude. So we have to climb back again. And then we get up as high as we can. And then we glide again. We find the next thermal. So as long as there are thermals, as long as you're able to find those thermals, you can continue this path. But that's going to change because as the weather conditions change on a daily basis, as the temperature changes, as you go from morning to afternoon to evening, as the wind pattern changes, everything can change, sometimes dramatically, right? But let's pretend that everything is okay. You can go from one thermal, glide to the next, get up the next thermal, and keep going. If you're hill soaring that you talked about, you can keep going on these hill ridges back and forth. So those are a couple of really interesting ways to travel that can get you into a decent distance. And of course, that mountain wave can get you really long distance and very high.
And from an airplane pilot standpoint, because I hope some of them are interested now in trying gliding, it's still a little bit like fuel management. You know how far and how long you can go with fuel. It sounds like there's a similar element of planning with, again, some of the unknowns with the weather, but planning that you can get this far before you have to turn back for the airport or this far before you have to start figuring out where to get to a spot to get down to your landing place. So there's a little bit of similarities in planning ahead, but just a few more unknowns with the weather. Is that a good way of describing that?
Yeah, that's a very good way of describing it. But when you are flying in a regular airplane, if I can say that, you can determine how much fuel to take, how many people to take, how much bags to put, how far you're going to go, where you're going to land before you refuel. In a glider, you can plan that, but since the mother nature is the one that's controlling all these factors, despite your best planning, things may not work out. In fact, chances are they're not going to work out as well as you plan. Rarely do we go and things are way better than we thought. Usually it's like what we thought or worse. So you got to be careful and maybe add that extra element of precaution, right? So I mentioned that you can start, let's say you start flying around 11 o'clock, everything is great. And then when you come back at 3 o'clock, the wind have shifted. The sun is starting to go down. And then now the thermals are weak. So you may not be able to go the same distance. Just keep that in mind. But the fuel analogy, I think, is very good. I'll just share my personal example. When I was early in my career in glider, I did a what we call as a 100K flight, which is a 50 kilometers out and 50 kilometers back without stopping. And that was part of one of our training programs. It is difficult, 100 kilometers. And that was daunting for me as a new pilot, new glider pilot, because I don't have a propeller, I don't have an engine, right? And it worked out very well. I did a good job. It took me like a couple of hours to do it, but things got very interesting. So I did this in upstate New York. If you're familiar, the Hudson River runs north south on the eastern edge of New York. What you may not know is the lift that is coming off the thermals over the river is zero or almost zero. So when you're crossing this river, whatever lift you had, you're going to lose. So if you were not at the proper altitude and you're crossing it, you're going to keep sinking and sinking and sinking and sinking. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was down to, I don't know, something like 800 feet from the
Oh,
ground, which is
that's pretty low. That's pretty low.
very low. But that's where experience comes in. You learn that sometimes people don't understand this, like junkyards or quarries. These kind of places can produce these thermals. So you find those and slowly scrape yourself up. And that's what I did. And I was successful. But I would bet that every glider pilot has these kind of stories to tell as to where they almost did not make it. Sometimes they did not make it, but most of us almost did not make it.
You talked about landing out, so that's an instance where that's possible if you get too low. And at that point, 800 feet, it sounds like you just need to look for that farmer's field or a safe place to land then.
That is a very good point. So this is what we do before we even take this trip. First of all, we see if there's even airports anywhere near. So you kind of alter your path. Instead of going from here to there in a straight line, you zigzag, kind of like a sailboat tacking through winds. That's what we do, and we try to go so that if we lose lift, can we land safely at the airport? That's our number one priority. If you cannot make an airport, can you find a flat enough field? Because if what if you're flying over mountainous terrain? What if you're flying over an urban area? So you have to be carefully planning that. So all those things go back into pre-flight planning. And again, this is experience. This is where good instruction and good training comes into picture.
That 100K flight sounds like it was pretty adventurous. It sounds like it turned out well in the end and that you managed to make that work in the end. And I look forward to getting more than a few miles from the home airport. I haven't gotten there yet, but I think with some more training and some better luck with the weather, I can venture out a little further. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, most people, like how I did this is every time you fly, you try to increase the distance you're going. First, it's 5 miles, then it's 10 miles, and keep going until you get comfortable being away. Now, this distance, there's also time, right? Sometimes in order to fly long distance, it takes time, but there's also endurance records. Gliders have stayed up in the air for a long time too.
Hours and hours, you mentioned. So that's part of getting the altitude in order to stay aloft for that long and make the distances too. So it all fits together.
Yeah, and once again, sort of late spring, early summer is very good. And I did this in upstate New York. I have personally stayed up for 5.5 hours That is the longest flight I've had in a glider with no engines. Did I mention that?
That's right. No engines, no cheating, right?
Right.
It's something that takes a while to get your head wrapped around, even when you're in it and learning. And again, I aspire to getting that much higher and that much further as I build glider experience, because I think like the 4,000 or 5,000 feet, what altitude I mentioned, I think when I got that high, my flight lasted about half an hour. So that's my personal best in terms of time. So I'm getting there, and I like your idea of taking it one step further at a time. That way you feel more comfortable, and certainly you're a little safer doing that. So that's definitely something to look forward to this spring and summer.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
So, not having experienced glider flights that far or that high, like you talked about, there's kind of a burning question I think people might have right about now. So you're up there for hours and you're in the middle of nowhere above a mountain. What if you have to go to the restroom?
So
Gotta ask.
that's what I call as a pilot's trade secrets. Let's just say there are ways to deal with this thing. I will just leave it at that.
Okay, let's just leave it at that. We don't need any TMI here. Okay, thanks, Gopal. So we'll get to the real burning question that is next here, and that is, what is the distance record for a glider?
So the distance record, and I just looked it up. And if you don't know, in the US, we have an organization called the Soaring Society of America, SSA.org. We'll put the link in the description. You can go look this up. The current record for distance in America is over 1,300 miles.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a long way, isn't it? So I did my 100K flight that I talked about. So if I convert 100K, which is 100 kilometers, into miles, that's a little over 60 miles. So I was happy with a 60-mile flight, and these guys did almost 1,400 miles. It is just astonishing.
That is really cool. And wow, I guess I'm only in the 10K myself. So, Gopal, I've got a ways to go. You're talking about what experienced glider pilots do along with these records. So, I guess I've got some work to do. I don't think people had any idea how high and how far and how long gliders can go. And it seems like at this point, not having fuel is an advantage. And that's just really, really awesome way of thinking about flight, because the levels you can get to, no pun intended, the levels you can get to in flight without an engine and without fuel, that's way, way beyond what we would have thought. That's really, really cool.
Yeah. So, any of you watching or listening to us, if you've never heard of gliders or sailplanes, there's plenty of ways to find out. There is this SSA.org, Soaring Society of America. There are British soaring societies, and there's soaring societies in every country, Australian Soaring Society. It's a very vibrant community everywhere in the world. And there are local glider clubs. Our local glider club is approximately 35 minutes from me. It's not that far. And maybe not everybody lives that close, but there are a lot of glider clubs. Look them up. They would be happy to give you what they call as a discovery ride. You go with an instructor, take a flight, they'll take you up, and it is a fabulous experience. You're going to love it. I describe it as it's zen-like. That's how it feels. It's very peaceful.
That's one of the really cool things I discovered about glider clubs, which is the most common way people get out and experience soaring, is that you've got to have multiple people on the ground and a tow plane pilot to get you off the ground. And once you're released from the rope, you're by yourself, or maybe with one other person if you happen to be in a two-seat glider. But in most cases, you're by yourself and having this really neat solitary experience. So the idea of having a community of people to help each other out as glider pilots and then going up to experience this alone is just a really neat way of, I would say, spending a summer day on a really nice Saturday. It's a lot of fun.
For any of you, if you want to learn more about gliders, let us know in the comments, because there's more interesting topics we can get into. There's competition flying, there's cross country soaring, there's all kinds of interesting things that we can get into. So let us know, and we'll be happy to take that up in a future episode. Elaine, both you and I started as airplane or power plane pilots, the propeller kind, and then transitioned into gliders late in our career, we were experienced in power planes. I know what I went through, and a lot of things were surprising to me as I was going through glider training. What was your take on that?
I'd heard of it early on, and I thought, oh, someday I'll get to try it. And some time went by, and finally, a few summers ago, I had the time at the opportunity, and they actually had some fellow powered airplane pilots who also wanted to train in gliders and make the transition. So it ended up being a really fun team activity. And so that was a great way to start one summer. And the whole time we were all talking about how nervous we were because without an engine in airplane, you're in emergency mode. I mean, we trained for a long time and continually train to deal with the possibility of an engine failure. Airplanes obviously aren't designed to go that far if they lose their engines. So it took a little bit getting our heads wrapped around that idea. And so the first glider lesson I took, just a short lesson on a nice day with an instructor, I was nervous all the way up to the point of the rope release. And I got to do the toe release. There's a yellow lever that both the instructor and the pilot in front have to release the rope. So it's really easy to do. And when I was given a cue, okay, release, and all the safety checks were done, I said, okay, here goes. And I pulled the yellow lever, and all of a sudden it got quiet. And we were turning and soaring, and I was allowed to practice flying the glider around, and it was an amazing experience. But the whole time I was just a little nervous about not having an engine.
Yeah, so I can relate to that, right? As airplane pilots, like you said, losing an engine is an emergency. You got to get on the ground immediately. In a glider, that's way of life. Every flight is no engines. Welcome to glider world. And the other thing is, in an earlier episode, we talked about go arounds where you can have a near miss, and because there's something on the runway, you take off again. Guess what? In a glider, you can't do that. So you have to set up your landing almost perfectly well before you come into landing. And that all takes experience. And I can imagine how daunting it is to somebody who has never done that. I know of a lot of very experienced airplane pilots who will not get in a glider. I'm not flying it without engine. But I will tell you, and I don't know what you thought, I will tell you, learning to fly a glider made me a better airplane pilot. It just did. I just became much more in tune with the weather, the wind, learning the terrain. And also, we didn't talk about this, gliders don't have a lot of avionics and instrumentation. We don't have all these gauges. So you have to fly a, shall I say, more primitive flying machine. So that teaches you how to fly more what we'll call as a seat of the pants feel. You got to feel it.
Definitely agree with you. It's a really pure form of flight, and I think that's the fun, whether you start out as just a glider pilot, because there are lots of awesome glider pilots who just started as that. They did not transition from powered airplanes. And we all have that common sense of just enjoying this sensation of flight. And it also helps when you get back to the airplane and you can think a little more carefully about the weather and about gliding in case there was an engine failure in the airplane. I think that gave me just a little bit more confidence that I could handle the descent planning in an emergency and make a good landing if I had to. And so I would definitely say for any powered airplane pilot, learning to fly gliders makes you a better pilot.
Some people may not be aware of that. It actually is easier for some to start with glider training before they become airplane pilots. The glider training, at least in the US, allows you to solo, meaning fly the airplane by yourself, the glider by yourself, when you're 14, and you can get a pilot certificate when you're 16. If you start with a powered airplane, you have to be 16 to solo and at least 17 before you can get your license. So you can actually become a glider pilot early, and that actually helps when you want to become a power plane pilot later on.
That's great. Mentioning the transition between gliders into powered aircraft, because I think glider pilots have a great advantage. They have already gotten the art of flying stick and rudder down before they get into the powered airplane. And so I think all those advantages are there. And the age advantage in terms of people who are interested in learning how to fly when they're young is fantastic. And I think that's a little known fact that you can start at 14, a couple years ahead of powered airplanes. And if you do eventually want to get into airplanes, you're better off doing that because you learn so much more starting out,
Yeah.
and it's a really cheap way to learn to fly in the end because you don't have to pay for fuel.
100%, 100%. And you mentioned stick and rudder. I equate that to learning to drive in a stick shift car with a rear wheel drive with no power steering, no power assist. And then you can drive all these fancy cars. That's how it feels. The gliders are kind of like the 1960s type machines, although there are some very, very fancy glider. We talked about Perlan. Elaine, we have one more surprising fact for our viewers and listeners. What is one very famous, very well known aircraft out there that is actually a glider, even though it does not feel like a glider?
Aircraft that is well known and is a glider. We talked about Perlan, so it must be something else.
So the space shuttle. Space
Space
shuttle
shuttle.
is a glider.
The space shuttle is a glider. That's so easy to forget because it goes up on a rocket, but it doesn't have an engine or jet engine.
Exactly. So the rocket brings it up to orbit and then it orbits. When it comes back, it is a glider. It does not have any other propulsion. So we talked about how glider flying helps airplane pilots. Talk about that. Now, from thousands of feet high, they're trying to aim for that runway in Cape Canaveral or Edwards Air Force Base, and they have to set that up. And if they miss it, that's it. There's no other option. They can't go around. So they have to land. So talk about precision. So people don't realize it, but a space shuttle is a really fancy glider at the end.
That is really cool. I don't think we'll look at the space shuttle the same. And even though that program has ended, I could see using that concept in the future or more reusable space vehicles. Maybe we'll get there sometime because I love the description of a really fancy glider. That is astounding.
Yeah, the glider designs are by definition more efficient. By the way, if you go to Cape Canaveral Space Shuttle landing runway, there are plaques where the nose gear of the space shuttle ended on its last flight, like the last landing of Atlantis, last landing of Discovery. So they have a plaque. And if you look at this, the surprising fact is between two space shuttles, they were within 30 or 40 feet of each other. So
Really.
I am just astounded by the fact that they start at a space orbit and come and land, and they come to stop within less than 50 feet of each other. How incredible is that?
That is really cool. I did not know that either. So they marked where the nose wheels stopped when they landed those space shuttles, and they were within just feet of each other. Talk about precision. That's really amazing because if you've ever gone to the museums where they have some of the space shuttles housed, these are huge, huge aircraft.
So you've been listening to us and watching us talk passionately about gliders and sailplane. We want to know if we piqued your curiosity, and dare I say, if you were intrigued by it. So please let us know as to what else you want to see and what you learned from it. If we excited you, if we got you interested, we would love to know that. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We have another exciting episode for you next time. So don't forget to tune in and make sure to follow, subscribe, and hit the like button and tell your friends about the show. We are now clear to land.
This is Aviation.